The hospital boardroom went silent the moment Dr. Whitfield held up my findings and called them his own. 200 people in that auditorium. Cameras rolling for the hospital's national research broadcast. And there he stood, reading my words off a slide I had built at 2 a.m, 3 nights in a row, while my daughter slept in a laundry basket beside my desk because I couldn't afford a sitter. He never once looked at me. Not when he said, "my research." Not when the room erupted in applause. Not when the dean shook his hand and called him a visionary. What nobody in that room knew, including him, was that I had already sent one email 4 days earlier. A single email, time-stamped, verified, sitting quietly in a compliance inbox he didn't know existed. He thought he had won. He had no idea he was about to hand me the very weapon I needed, wrapped in his own signature, stamped with his own name, delivered by his own hand. My name is Elena Cross, and 3 years ago I was a second-year internal medicine resident at Ashgrove Memorial, the kind of hospital that puts its founder's portrait in gold frames and forgets that the people keeping patients alive at 3 a.m. are mostly exhausted 28-year-olds running on vending machine coffee. I had come to medicine the hard way. No family doctors, no legacy admissions, no wealthy parents smoothing the path. I paid for my own MCAT prep by tutoring high schoolers on weekends, and I finished residency applications between hospital shadowing shifts because that was the only time I had. By the time I landed at Ashgrove, I had learned exactly one lesson that mattered more than anything they taught me in medical school. Keep records of everything because nobody is going to protect you but you. Dr. Marcus Whitfield ran our department like a kingdom. 54 years old, silver at the temples, the kind of charm that made hospital donors write checks without asking questions. He had built his reputation 20 years earlier on a single well-cited paper about early sepsis detection, and he had spent every year since coasting on that one success, terrified that somebody younger, hungrier, and smarter might eventually replace him. I didn't understand that fear yet. I just thought he was busy. I thought that was why he kept forgetting to mention my name in meetings, why he edited my case reports and initialed them without changing a single line, why he told me repeatedly that residents don't get authorship credit. That's simply how academic medicine works. Be patient, pay your dues. I believed him because I wanted to. I had a 6-year-old daughter named Maya at home, an ex-husband who paid child support exactly when he felt like it, and a mortgage that didn't care about my feelings.
I needed this job.
I needed the recommendation letter Whitfield could write for my fellowship application. So when he asked me to compile the data for what he called his diagnostic algorithm project, an early detection model for pediatric sepsis that could flag deteriorating patients hours before a doctor would normally notice, I said yes immediately, and I told myself that if I just worked hard enough, long enough, quietly enough, he would eventually see me the way I saw myself. For 4 months, I built that project practically alone. I pulled 22 months of patient vitals from our electronic health system. I cross-referenced lab values against outcomes. I wrote the statistical model that eventually became the backbone of the entire study, working nights after 12-hour shifts, building charts on my kitchen table while Maya did her homework beside me, both of us falling asleep some nights with our foreheads nearly touching over the same table lamp. Whitfield's contribution in total consisted of 4 meetings where he told me the direction was promising, and 1 afternoon where he changed the font on my slides and told me it now looked like serious research. I didn't mind the imbalance of effort, not at first. Residency teaches you to swallow imbalance the way you swallow bad coffee, quickly, without tasting it too much. What I minded, what I couldn't swallow, was a small thing Whitfield said to me in passing during our 3rd meeting, almost as an afterthought, while he was scrolling through his phone. He told me that when the project was ready, it would need one voice behind it for the showcase, that multiple names on a slide made a presentation look disorganized, and that as chief, it made the most institutional sense for that voice to be his. I remember nodding. I remember thinking that's just how it works here. I didn't yet understand that he wasn't describing a tradition. He was giving me a warning, dressed up as an explanation, and I was too tired and too hopeful to hear it for what it was. Everything shifted in March, during a routine departmental data audit that almost never happened at all, one of those bureaucratic formalities the hospital ran once a year mostly to satisfy an accreditation checklist. A compliance officer named David Reyes, a A quiet man in his 40s who wore the same navy cardigan every single day and spoke like every word cost him something, called me into his office and asked a question that made my stomach drop. He wanted to know why 17 patient records in my dataset showed vital sign entries that had been manually altered after the original nursing documentation was submitted. Altered, he said, to make the algorithm's predictions look more accurate than they actually were, closer to perfect than any early detection model in this field had ever legitimately claimed to be. I told him I had never touched those entries. I hadn't. My hands went cold sitting in that chair, because I understood immediately what an accusation like that could mean for a second-year resident with no institutional power and no one senior standing beside her. And when Reyes turned his monitor around and pulled up the internal edit history, the digital fingerprint attached to those 17 altered records did not belong to me. It belonged to Marcus Whitfield. I stared at the screen for a long moment, and Reyes watched my face carefully, the way people do when they're testing whether your shock is real or rehearsed. I think that was the moment he decided to trust me, though he didn't say so yet. He simply closed the file, folded his hands on the desk, and asked me one more question, quiet and direct. He asked whether anyone had ever pressured me to adjust numbers, smooth outliers, or make the model's results look cleaner than the raw data actually supported. And for the first time in 3 years at Ashgrove, I didn't have an easy answer. Reyes didn't accuse anyone that day. He simply told me, in the calm and careful voice of someone trained to say exactly enough and nothing more, that the audit was ongoing and that I should preserve any documentation I had related to the project. I remember walking out of his office and standing in the hallway for a full minute, staring at nothing, while residents and nurses moved past me in both directions like the world hadn't just tilted 12 degrees. Two competing truths had collided inside my chest at once. My chief, the man who held my fellowship recommendation in his hands, the man the entire hospital treated like a genius, had quietly falsified data inside a project I had built with my own hands. And somehow, if this ever became public without careful handling, I understood exactly who the hospital would blame first. Not the department chief with 20 years of institutional trust and a wall of framed accolades. Me. The resident whose name was barely attached to the paperwork in the first place. That night, after Maya fell asleep with her math homework still open on the table, I sat down and did the only thing that had ever truly protected me in my life. I built a record. I saved every version of my dataset with its original timestamps, going back to the very first spreadsheet I had built in October. I saved every email where Whitfield had asked me to smooth the numbers a little, or tighten the outliers so the model reads cleaner, language that had sounded, at the time, like ordinary academic polish, and now read like something closer to an instruction I hadn't recognized as one. I saved the file metadata, showing his login credentials attached to the 17 altered entries, printing screenshots the old-fashioned way in case anything digital ever mysteriously disappeared. I even called my cousin, a paralegal in Ohio, just to ask her, in the most casual voice I could manage, what it actually meant to preserve evidence properly. She told me 3 words I never forgot: date everything twice. Then I did something I had never done in 3 years at Ashgrove. I filed a formal research integrity complaint, addressed not to my department, but directly to the hospital's independent compliance office, the one body in the entire institution that Whitfield did not have influence over because it reported straight to the board rather than through the medical hierarchy he controlled. I filed it on a Tuesday morning, my hands shaking slightly as I hit send, half convinced I had just detonated my own career. 4 days later, on that Saturday, in a packed auditorium under television lights, Whitfield stood on stage at the hospital's National Research Showcase and presented my algorithm, my data, my 4 months of work, as his own singular achievement, without a single mention of my name. He didn't know about the complaint yet. Compliance investigations at Ashgrove moved slowly, deliberately, quietly, exactly the way they were designed to. He thought he had gotten away clean. He thought the story ended with him holding a plaque, being profiled in the hospital newsletter, being congratulated by the dean for an innovation that would put Ashgrove on the national map. He had no idea that in taking full credit in public in front of cameras, in a way that was now permanently recorded and time-stamped and broadcast to the entire medical community, he had just handed the compliance office something they needed far more than my complaint alone. Proof of motive. Proof that a man who had altered data to make a model look better than it was had also, for days after being reported, chosen to publicly and unambiguously claim sole ownership of the very research under investigation. A colleague sitting beside me, a fellow resident named Priya, who had no idea about the complaint I had filed days earlier, leaned over and whispered, "Didn't you build half of that?" I just smiled and shook my head slightly, the way you do when you're holding something too fragile to speak about out loud yet. She didn't push. She simply squeezed my hand once under the armrest, a small gesture that told me she already suspected more than she was saying, and turned her attention back to the stage. I sat in the fourth row that day and watched him smile under the stage lights, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel angry. I felt strangely, terrifyingly calm, because I understood something he didn't yet know I understood. He had just written the final chapter of his own downfall, in his own voice, in front of witnesses, and there was nothing he could do to take it back. The investigation took 11 weeks, and every single one of them felt longer than the last. Reyes called me in twice more, always careful, always measured, never letting a single expression cross his face that might tell me which way the wind was blowing. He gathered statements from 3 nurses whose original vital sign entries had been overwritten, women who had been quietly furious for months about numbers that didn't match what they remembered charting, but who had never known who to tell or whether telling would cost them their jobs. He pulled audit logs from the hospital's IT department that confirmed Whitfield's login had made every single unauthorized edit, each one time-stamped to a Sunday evening when Whitfield believed, correctly, that almost no one else was working. And eventually, he requested a full copy of the presentation footage from the research showcase, the same footage the hospital's own marketing team had proudly published to their website within 24 hours, captioned, "Ashgrove Memorial leads the nation in pediatric innovation." In that footage, time-stamped and undeniable, Whitfield stood at the podium under warm stage lighting and stated, on the record, in his own confident voice, that the algorithm and its underlying dataset were entirely his personal work product, developed independently over the better part of a year. He even paused for effect before saying it, the way a man does when he knows a line will make the room fall in love with him. It was a claim compliance could now directly compare against the edit logs, the emails, and my preserved documentation, and prove, beyond any reasonable dispute, was false. He had not simply taken credit quietly in a hallway. He had built his own trap, lit it himself, and stepped into it in front of a camera crew. Word moved through the hospital the way it always does, in fragments, in whispers between shifts, in the particular silence that falls over a nurse's station when everyone knows something and no one is saying it out loud yet. A junior attending I barely knew stopped me by the elevators one afternoon and said only, "Heads up, people are asking questions about the showcase data," before the doors closed between us. I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly which questions and exactly where they would lead. 3 weeks before the final compliance hearing, Whitfield stopped me in the hallway outside the ICU. He looked smaller than I remembered him, the confidence I had spent 3 years admiring now replaced with something closer to panic held together with willpower and a very expensive watch. He told me he had heard about the audit findings, that people were saying things, that the whole situation had been blown wildly out of proportion by people who didn't understand how academic research actually worked. He told me that if I clarified my statement, softened it, said the data irregularities were a misunderstanding rather than deliberate falsification, he would personally guarantee my fellowship placement anywhere in the country, any program I wanted. He had the connections to make a single phone call and make it happen. I let him finish. I had learned over 3 years under him that letting a man finish talking was often the fastest way to see exactly who he really was. He said we could still fix this together, quietly, the way problems inside a hospital were supposed to be fixed, without lawyers, without headlines, without either of our careers getting dragged through the mud. He even used the word together, as if we had built something side by side, as if 4 months of solitary nights at my kitchen table had somehow been a partnership. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. I told him I wasn't interested in fixing anything quietly. I told him that for 3 years I had watched him take credit for other people's work because he knew we needed him more than he needed us, that I had watched residents before me leave this hospital defeated and unrecognized, and assumed it was simply the cost of doing business in medicine. I told him that the only thing I intended to protect now was the truth, and that I had spent 4 months building something that could genuinely help sick children recover faster, and I was not going to let his fear of being replaced turn that into another quiet cover-up. He started to say something else, some final attempt at persuasion, but I didn't wait to hear it. I walked past him into the ICU because a patient needed me, and for once in 3 years, that felt like the only version of power that had ever actually mattered. The compliance hearing itself was closed to the public, held in a small conference room on the hospital's 4th floor with no cameras and no audience, just Reyes, 2 board members, a hospital attorney, Whitfield, and me. I testified for just under 2 hours. I brought printed copies of every email, every dataset version, every timestamp, laid out in chronological order the way my cousin had taught me, so that anyone in the room could follow the entire timeline without needing me to explain a single gap. Whitfield's own attorney, at one point, asked to see the original file metadata a second time, and I watched his face change as he read it, the particular stillness of a lawyer realizing his client has already lost. Whitfield himself said very little. He had built his career on being the most articulate person in every room he entered, and in that conference room, for the first time in 20 years, he had nothing persuasive left to say. Its outcome, unlike the hearing itself, was not private for long. Ashgrove Memorial's board voted to place Dr. Marcus Whitfield on immediate unpaid leave pending a full external review, a review that, 6 weeks later, confirmed every finding Reyes's office had documented. The 17 altered patient records, the falsified metrics in the sepsis algorithm, the public claim of sole authorship over research he had not designed, built, or executed. The hospital statement, when it finally came, was careful and clinical, the way institutions always are when they're protecting themselves as much as anyone else, but the outcome was unmistakable. Whitfield's research privileges were permanently revoked. His name was formally removed from the algorithm's authorship record. And the paper itself, the one meant to make Ashgrove Memorial famous, was withdrawn from consideration for national publication, pending a complete re-review under my name as principal investigator, with corrected, verified, unaltered data. He didn't fight it publicly. Men like Whitfield rarely do, because a public fight would mean a public trial of every detail, and the details were the one thing he couldn't survive. He submitted his resignation 4 days after the board's decision, releasing a brief statement about wanting to pursue new opportunities outside clinical research, language so carefully sanded down it barely resembled what had actually happened. Within a month, according to people who still worked in that department, he had left the state entirely, taking a quiet administrative position somewhere far from patient care, far from research, far from any room where his name might be recognized by anyone who had read the news out of Ashgrove that spring. I want to say I felt triumphant when I heard the news, but the truth was quieter than that. I felt something closer to relief, the specific kind of relief that comes after you've spent years believing you were the only person who could see something clearly, and then finally, someone with authority looks at the same evidence and says, "Yes, you were right all along." I picked Maya up from school that afternoon, and when she asked me why I looked different, lighter somehow, I told her the truth in words a 6-year-old could understand. I told her that someone had tried to take something that was mine, and that instead of yelling about it, I had simply written down everything true and waited. She thought about that for a moment, the way kids do when they're turning an idea over carefully, and then she said, "So, the truth was the trick the whole time?" And I told her, "Yes, baby, the truth was the trick the whole time, and it usually is if you're patient enough to let it work." 6 months later, the sepsis detection algorithm was published under its corrected authorship, my name first, in a journal that mattered, with data that had never been touched by anyone but me. It's being piloted now in 4 hospitals across 2 states, flagging deteriorating children hours earlier than doctors could catch on their own, buying time that sometimes makes the difference between a hard week and a funeral. I think about that more than I think about Whitfield. I think about the fact that the version of this story that gets remembered isn't the one where a chief doctor stole credit from a tired resident. It's the one where the data, real and unaltered and patiently preserved, ended up saving lives exactly the way it was always supposed to. There was a smaller moment, one nobody wrote about in any hospital newsletter, that mattered to me more than the published paper ever did. A few months after Whitfield left, one of the 3 nurses who had testified about her overwritten vital sign entries found me in the break room and thanked me, quietly, almost shyly, for filing the complaint in the first place. She told me she had suspected something was wrong for over a year, but had never felt like anyone with real power would believe a nurse over a department chief. She said watching the outcome had changed how she thought about speaking up. I didn't feel like a hero in that moment. I felt like someone who had simply refused to let a lie sit unchallenged, and it turned out that refusal had rippled further than I ever expected it to. I still keep records of everything. That part of me never changed, and I don't think it ever will. Every dataset I touch now gets backed up twice, dated twice, documented in language so precise that no one could ever twist it into something it isn't. But these days, I don't keep them because I'm afraid of what someone might try to take from me. I keep them because I finally understand what my first 3 years in medicine were actually trying to teach me, the lesson that took a stolen presentation and 11 anxious weeks to fully sink in. Credit, in the end, always finds its way back to the truth. You just have to be patient enough and precise enough and quiet enough to let it. Maya is 9 now, and sometimes, when she's struggling with something that feels unfair to her, some small classroom injustice that looms enormous at her age, I tell her the same thing I told her that afternoon 3 years ago. I tell her that the loudest person in the room isn't always the one who wins in the end. Sometimes the person who wins is simply the one who wrote everything down and waited and told the truth when it finally mattered. She rolls her eyes at me sometimes, the way 9-year-olds do at mothers who repeat themselves. But she remembers it. I can tell, because every so often, when something at school doesn't go her way, she comes home and quietly writes down exactly what happened, in her own careful handwriting, just in case. And every time I see that notebook open on her desk, I think of that auditorium and that stage light and the 4 days that separated a stolen presentation from a report that could no longer be denied. I think about how the truth doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply waits, patiently, for the right moment to speak for itself.